NASA's forbidden machine. The men who turned off gravity. The wrench didn't fall. It shivered in midair, slid sideways like a fish in a current, and kissed the bay wall with a dull ring. Then the lights dipped. Someone yelled to kill it. The kill didn't take. 6 seconds stretched forever, and when the breakers finally slammed, the room smelled like hot bearings and ozone. Here's the context they buried. The team called it Project Anchor. The last night they ran the machine, 3 engineers vanished. Months later, a hard drive surfaced with specs claiming gravity neutralization, vector bleed, and a term that shouldn't exist in the 199s. It matches a 2026 anomaly. Rewind. The rumor that wouldn't die. The first whisper didn't sound like a discovery. It sounded like a warning. An internal email chain from the late 1990s flagged Anchor as a hazard, not a project. No distribution lists. Just a handful of names, cautious language, and one line that stuck. Lift event must not exceed 6 seconds. 6. Not 5. Not 7. Outside those walls, the chatter felt radioactive. In 1992, Eugene Podkletnov claimed a rotating YBCO superconductor disk produced a tiny gravity shielding effect. Most physicists rolled their eyes. But the claim didn't die. NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center put quiet resources behind a replication push remembered as Delta G. Officially, inconclusive. Unofficially, the phrase you heard in hallways was career hazard. You didn't link your name to anything that smelled like anti-gravity unless you wanted to eat alone at conferences. Meanwhile, inside a contract machine shop an hour from a test range, a machinist remembered a part that fought him back. A non-ferrous lattice, light but stubborn, that ate torque. He thought he'd misaligned his tool. He hadn't. The spec called for tolerances that suggested cryogenic shrink fit, routed for a superconductive bus. He signed the secrecy page, finished the job, and went home with sore wrists and a story he didn't tell for 20 years. It was the first time he heard 6-second ceiling, said like a rule, not a rumor. Here's why a gravity claim makes enemies fast. Budgets are gravity. Careers orbit reputation. If you say you can bend the most reliable constant anyone knows, you're not just challenging a theory. You're threatening launch schedules, guidance assumptions, and contract roadmaps that feed entire centers. At NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center during the Delta G era, senior engineers learned to split sentences. We're evaluating rotational field interactions, not we're testing gravity. Language kept doors open and knives sheathed. Anchor didn't use euphemisms. In the coffee-stained blueprints that survive, there's a thick black note scrawled in the margin. Don't rotate past 0.7. No unit. Just a hard limit. A second scribble adds, phase, not RPM. Whoever wrote it knew the fight wasn't with speed. It was with how the machine's fields talked to each other. If you've ever watched a bridge start to dance in a crosswind, you know this feeling. It's not the gust. It's the coherence. 3 names that anchored the email thread disappeared from org charts within a quarter. Not fired. Not promoted. Just gone. Their offices reassigned. Their phones deactivated. HR shrugged, reassigned. Their families heard, sensitive work. Pensions marked pending. The kind of paperwork fog that makes people stop asking questions because they still need a badge tomorrow. The rumor refused to die because it kept finding body heat. A vendor ledger showed bills for cryo pumps and mu metal shielding routed through a shell company that didn't exist a year earlier. A loading dock schedule listed rotor, non-ferrous, do not tip, on a day that security cameras went conveniently to gray. A technician recalled a wrench that felt lighter for a breath, then drifted sideways like someone nudged it from another room. He told himself vibration. He told the polygraph the same, years later, and passed when he finally said it wasn't. You can map the fear in small human choices. A safety officer bought extra fire extinguishers out of pocket and put a second exit bar on a door that code said didn't need it. He penciled procedures in the margins of a binder. Staged ramp, hard limit, manual abort. He'd read the Delta G postmortems on rotor overspeed risks. He knew how quickly a clean lab becomes a room full of shrapnel. On one checklist, he added a quiet line: remove watches, rings. Not for pinch hazards, he was thinking field distortions near skin. Get this, one invoice from a calibration contractor included post-anomaly floor repair. That's not a phrase you see every day. Floors crack for reasons you can name. Settlement, forklift, a dropped crate. Post-anomaly doesn't live in a warehouse. It lives in a lab that had a night no one wants to write down. Why vector bleed? The term shows up in an anchor memo like a shrug. It means the force you want, upward, clean, leaks sideways, through the structure. In human terms, a wrench slides left while your scale says the load got lighter. It's the signature people keep repeating without agreeing to it out loud. During the 1990s superconductor tests, some teams reported tools drifting when they shouldn't. Officially, vibration. Unofficially, something was tugging. And then there's the math that shouldn't have existed then. Mass fraction inversion. Rocketeers use mass fraction to describe how much of your vehicle is propellant versus payload and structure. Inversion suggests a regime where adding electrical power changes the effective inertia in your favor. You don't defy gravity. You bias inertia. In the 1990s, that idea belonged to thought experiments and bar arguments. Decades later, confidential propulsion papers started using a cousin phrase, topology-induced inertial bias, to hint at the same thing. The bridge from one to the other looks like anchor. So why call it anchor? Because that's what you name a thing you hope will hold you steady while the world moves. Or because irony keeps engineers sane. Either way, the name stuck to a machine built around counter-rotating rings, a superconductive bus, and a cage that wanted to be a phase gate more than a guardrail. The rumor's shape never changed. A limit at 0.7, a 6-second ceiling, a sideways tug. The enemy wasn't a person. It was the reflex that protects institutions. Contain what looks dangerous. Starve what looks embarrassing. Deny what looks unbelievable. Then, if you must, move the people who won't stop the work. Anchor lived in that reflex and used it as cover. To understand Anchor, we need to see the machine that wasn't supposed to run. The machine, anatomy of a forbidden prototype. They built it like a dare. 2 counter-rotating rings nested inside a hexagonal frame, each ring sleeved in a superconductive bus that looked overbuilt until you traced the current paths. Between them sat a cage. Not a guard, not really. The notes call it a phase gate, as if the machine didn't just spin, it synchronized. You don't get language like that unless someone saw timing matter more than torque. The drive specs on that hard disk don't read like science fiction. They read like a work order from a team that had already broken bearings. Coil wind density is called out to the gram per meter. Cryogenic thresholds are underlined with a temperature window, so tight it tells you they blew a run when a valve hiccuped. And there's a number that repeats like a nervous tick, 14.3 kilohertz. Harmonic targets, not motor speed, field rhythm. If you've ever tuned a radio by ear until the static clicks into a voice, you know how this feels in your bones. Echoes of Podkletnov sit all over the margins. YBCO as the superconductive lineage. Disk geometries that nod at the 1992 rotating disk claims while insisting everything is bus-fed, not bulk-fed. That matters. A bus lets you pump coherence across a structure instead of asking one spinning slab to be perfect. They learn from other people's bruises. The human angles hide in pencil. The lead engineer's checklist has 14 boxes and one prayer. Pray the bearings hold. Not a joke. Not sentiment. Bearings fail when coherence sneaks up on you. Resonance doesn't just rattle, it unloads weight, reloads it someplace you didn't bolt for, and turns a smooth rotor into a sledgehammer. That line says they'd felt the machine come alive in a way math didn't fully predict. What the logs call anomaly isn't polite. Under an instrumented load cell, mass drift shows up as a slow creep that spikes during near -0.68 phase coherence. The term phase coherence shows up in red a lot, paired with a caution triangle. When the system walked into that window, lateral flags tripped. Vector bleed. A tool sitting on a mat slid 2 inches east while the scale read lighter. The cameras caught nothing dramatic, because 6 seconds is both forever and not enough for clean video. Vendors tell their own kind of story. Billing trails stop mid-iteration. Part numbers jump sequences, like someone swapped a vendor and kept the drawing but changed the metal. That's a classic trick when procurement has eyes you don't control. You hide the upgrade in a familiar invoice and hope no one notices the alloy code. They noticed. The trail bends around a pump that chilled the bus 4 degrees colder than the published need. That's how you buy yourself a margin for coherence without writing it down. Every surface on the machine seems to answer a problem you can't see in a photograph. The rings carry split laminations to bleed eddy currents where you want them small, but they bulk them where the phase gate hands off. The cage looks like a Faraday shield until you map the grounding and realize it's staged. Ground, float, ground. That's not shielding, that's choreography. They were balancing fields like plates on sticks. The power feeds are uglier than you want in a lab. Stacks of caps that look like they came off a radar project, snubbers that scream fear of runaway Q, and a hand-soldered board with a note. Kill here if kill fails. Redundancy in a place redundancy shouldn't need to exist. The safety officer's fingerprints are everywhere, translated into bolts and bar stock. He didn't trust software when the room started to hum. You can feel the arguments in the documentation. One voice wants to push frequency. Another insists phase is the lever. The compromise is a staged ramp. The machine winds up in speed while the bus stays quiet. Then the bus wakes and the rotor relaxes. Control by detuning, like you're luring coherence into a pen you can close. It only works if you know exactly where the beast lives. Their circles around .68 say they found the pen, then watch the lock slip. If you've never stood next to a big rotor under cryo, you don't know the silence that falls right before the weirdness starts. The notes get terse in those windows. Load drift, 0.3%. Side tug mild. Abort, manual. There's a handwritten addendum on one run. Gloves off next time? It's a bad joke about dexterity and a tell about stakes. He wanted to feel switches because he didn't trust relays. When a room can reach sideways, you stop trusting anything you can't yank. The machine's foundation tells more truth than any memo. The mounting points are overbuilt with mu-metal collars, as if they were tired of fields leaking through bolts. If vector bleed is real, that's exactly where it hides, through the places your structure pretends is neutral. The scorches that show up later arc where those mounts meet floor. A good engineer designs for the force you want. A great one learns where the force will cheat. There's a blank on the drawing tree labeled anchor, 3C. Earlier revs show ring diameter growth and bus cross-section increases. 3C means the third child of a third generation. You don't get to see unless be worked just well enough to scare you. And tucked into the file tree is an error video of a rotor wobble that shouldn't exist in that bearing class. The caption is 3 words, not mechanical. Field. If this machine never ran, it wouldn't have these scars. If it only ran once, you wouldn't see procedural fatigue in the notes. This looks like a team that walked up to a cliff, chalked their footprints, took a step, and discovered the cliff had edges and directions nobody names in building codes. If it worked even once, there'd be witnesses. So who saw it? Witness layer 1, the technician and the polygraph. He didn't want to talk at first. He sat with his hands flat on the table, knuckles pale, and stared at the recorder like it might blink back. He'd signed the same secrecy forms everyone did. He'd kept quiet through job changes and health scares and a divorce. But when I slid a photocopy of the "Don't rotate past .7" note across the table, he exhaled and said, "We crossed it once." That was the sentence that opened the door. He remembered the room by sound. The soft roar of the chillers. The sharper whine as the rings climbed. A nothing sound when the bus woke, like the air getting thoughtful. He said the load cell display was boring right up until it wasn't. The numbers drifted, then jumped. A wrench on a rubber mat rose a hair, didn't drop, and slid left. That was when the safety officer said kill. He slapped the red, the software balked, and he reached for the manual. 6 seconds took their time. He didn't call it anti-gravity. He called it a bad idea that worked. His language was shop floor plain. Unload on the bearings, tingle in the forearms, a metallic taste when he inhaled the chill. He said he felt a tug at belt height, sideways, toward the east wall. When we got to the word vector bleed, he made a face. He'd heard the term only once, in a meeting with people who didn't belong to their org chart. They said if it lifts, it leaks. The leak is what'll break your mounts. We didn't take his story on faith. We put him on a polygraph with a veteran examiner who'd rather lose a client than tick the easy box. Baselines first, name, birthplace, the year he finished apprenticeship. Then irrelevant probes to map his tells. His pulse is calm. Respiratory curve smooth. Skin conductance steady. The examiner starts the relevant set. Did you see a tool leave the surface during a powered test? Yes. Did you feel a lateral force concurrent with a mass apparent drop? Yes. Did you fake any instrument readings? No. The tracings barely move on the first yes, flicker on the second, sit flat on the third. Control questions are designed to make everyone squirm. Have you ever lied to get out of trouble? He snorts. Yes. Have you ever stolen anything? He hesitates, says a pen in the 80s. The chart spikes like it should. When the examiner cycles back to anchor specifics, harmonic target, phase window, the only time the needles dance is when he guesses wrong on a part code. He says 14.5, the note says 14.3. When we show him the log with .68 marked in red, he taps it and says, "That's the byte. You feel it there." We pressed him on what he couldn't have known if he wasn't in the room. Where was the manual kill? He points to a diagram and gets it within 6 inches. What failed first when the kill didn't take? He says the snubbers heated and the breaker hesitated. We have a purchase order for a replacement breaker dated the next morning. Did anyone wear watches? He laughs and shakes his head. The safety officer had a tray by the door for rings and straps. We have a photo, wrist-shaped tan lines, and a felt-lined dish. He contradicted himself once, and it mattered. Early on he said the coil carrier was titanium. Later he said Inconel. He pauses, rewinds, and says, "Carrier was Inconel, the fasteners were T. We changed the carrier after a warp." That matches a part number jump in the vendor trail. He couldn't have known the invoice names. He remembered the feel of a bolt that wouldn't take galling compound. We asked about the people in suits. He said they came on a Friday, signed the manual log as consultants, and asked for a bench test with the bus cold. They talked in a vocabulary that sounded like NASA Marshall during the Delta G years. Rotor overspeed postmortems, coherence bands, Q-factor runaways. They didn't laugh when someone said Podkletnov out loud. They asked for a 6-second ceiling. They left with nothing but notes and a new voice in the next meeting. His fear wasn't theatrical. It showed up in small details. He kept his body between the rings and the exit on the last run. He had a blister stripe across his palm from yanking the manual abort. He still rubs it when he talks about the room. He said the floor felt wrong under his boots 2 days later, like the slab had been stressed in a way concrete doesn't like to remember. He didn't have the words for microfractures. He had the word hollow. When we finished the exam, the polygrapher pushed the folder across the table with the clipped tone he uses when he's sure. "He's truthful on the core claims," he said. The technician didn't smile. He just looked tired. He asked one question. "Are you going to say it worked?" We told him we were going to say what the instruments and the scars and his tracings let us say. He nodded, then handed us a photocopy of a checklist with one box unmarked. "We recorded one more run," he said. "The directory's missing on the drive you've got." That's the breadcrumb he didn't have to give. It put a time on the crisis we'd been circling and a hand on the door we hadn't opened yet. Paper trail, procurement, emails, and the missing week. The paper trail didn't start with a confession. It started with a receipt. A redacted purchase order for a pair of cryogenic pumps rated colder than the spec sheet claimed was necessary. The vendor name was familiar to anyone who's read NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center Delta Giera rosters, but the buyer of record wasn't a center, a lab, or even a prime. It was a shell LLC incorporated 2 months earlier at a mailbox store, dissolved a year later without assets. On its ledger, mu metal shielding by the square meter, vibration isolation feet rated well above the known mass of test article, and a breaker assembly that would get replaced the morning after everything went wrong. Freedom of information wasn't a door, it was a mail slot. Documents arrived blocked out like crossword puzzles. But dates survived. Serial numbers peeked through. When we stitched them, they drew a heartbeat. Pumps, then shielding. Caps by the pallet. A rush order for snubbers. Big power first, then the cage to keep it from chewing through the room. It tracked exactly like a team chasing coherence and learning the hard way that fields don't respect drywall. Emails spoke quieter, but they cut deeper. One thread, stamped internal, avoided all the words that make people curious. "Lift event window must not exceed 6S, someone wrote. No greeting. No signature beyond a department tag that doesn't exist anymore. Another line, manual log this week. That phrase sat like an apology. Why would you move from badged access to a spiral-bound notebook? Cameras were under maintenance. The access control system was intermittent. For 7 days, the logs went dark except for first names in pen. Call it the missing week. It started late on a Thursday, and by Friday the 6-second ceiling was in every email like a drumbeat. The last normal badge ping read 2112. After that, the timestamps lived in ink, not silicon. The entries are ordinary until they aren't. J. Patel, compressor check. M. Rivera, coil wind inspection. Then a gap. Then 3 signatures you won't find in the directory, all in the same tidy hand, all labeled consultant. They came in the afternoon, left after midnight, and took nothing but coffee and a stack of printouts you can't FOIA out of a shredder. The financials told a colder story. Hazard bonuses posted to accounts the Friday after the crisis run, then held. A memo flag, pending resolution. Froze pensions, froze transfers, froze questions. The Shell LLC cut the checks, then dissolved the quarter after the hard drive appeared. On the way out, it paid a contractor for floor remediation post-anomaly, and a separate line for EMI shielding repairs unplanned. That language reads like someone writing for the future, leaving breadcrumbs while pretending to mop. One email arrived like a shard of glass. Anchor 3C, do not exceed threshold parameters. Prior events suggest structural coupling at 0.68 phase coherence. If triggered, abort within 6s. There's no physics lecture, no boast, just a limit written like a nursery rhyme, because people remember rhythm when the room shakes. Whoever typed it knew that the weak link wasn't bravery. It was seconds. We hunted the calibration contractor. He answered on a number that still carried a city code from the 1990s and said he didn't do that kind of work anymore. When we read the invoice line, post-anomaly floor repair, he got quiet. I checked a level on a pad that shouldn't have moved, he said. The bubble wandered east a hair. Concrete doesn't wander. He wouldn't sign a statement. He did say he replaced 2 isolation feet because the rubber looked chewed without teeth. That image lived in our notes like a bruise. Procurement breadcrumbs lined up with the technician's memory in ways you can't fake if you weren't there. The breaker replacement landed on a purchase order the day after the night he slapped the kill and felt the hesitation. The Mu-metal sheets doubled midway through the build, right after internal emails started using the word bleed in lowercase like it was becoming furniture. And in the middle of the missing week, a courier ticket shows a run from the test bay to a building across campus where people sign different NDAs. The payload line reads, media encrypted. Why switch to manual logs? That's the kind of bureaucratic decision that sounds boring until you remember what the badge system does by default. It keeps time. It also creates a record you don't control. If you expect visitors with names that don't appear in phone books, you fall back to a notebook you can misplace. The missing week wasn't a glitch. It was protocol. Now, the email that mattered most arrived at 1:22 on a Sunday, sent to 3 addresses that bounced today. Terminate anchor activities pending external review. Continue equipment preservation. Do not transmit additional data via network systems. It locked in the missing week, the 6-second ceiling, and a switch from servers to shoes. Paper in pockets, not packets on wires. You can feel the hand on the brake and the hand over the mouth. Data didn't stop. Transmission did. That's how you move a story from a server to a hard drive in a locker months later. The paper didn't confess. It didn't have to. It marked time, drew limits, paid bills no one could explain, and named a week everyone pretends not to remember. And buried inside those muffled lines sat the one thing we needed most, the 6-second ceiling, written before anyone could argue it down. Forensic floor, scorches, stress, and vector bleed. The floor remembered what people tried to forget. You see it first as a discoloration along the anchor pads, half-moons of brown-black that don't read like an electrical blowout. Short-sleeve blossoms, almost flowers radiating from a point. These arcs trace like brushstrokes, all leaning the same way, curling east. If you overlay the machine footprint, those curves line up with the mounting bolts that took the worst of the load when the room went sideways. Not up. Sideways. We brought in a materials guy who spent his life listening to concrete lie. He ran a Schmidt hammer across the slab and frowned at the bounce-back numbers. Too soft along one axis, normal on the other. He drilled a core at the edge of a scorch and handed us a gray cylinder that looked like every other chunk of cured mix until you put it under light. Microfractures laced the aggregate like hairlines in tempered glass, but they weren't random. They stood at an angle marching east, like the slab had been pulled for a blink and then told to forget. Here's why that direction matters. If vector bleed is real, it can't just nudge air and tools. It has to find a path through the machine into the room. The mounts are the path. Bolts, collars, floor. The Mu-metal sleeves around the anchors were supposed to keep fields from biting the structure. The scorch arcs wrap right around those sleeves as if the bleed walked the steel, met the shielding, then spilled into concrete along the easiest way out. Everyone said electrical first. So we checked for copper ghosts, beads, spatter, the glassy spray you see when a bus bar lets go. Nothing. The arcs didn't pit. They smeared. When we scraped, the top layer flaked like a skin cooked from the inside. That points to heat arriving through conduction, not a flash from above. The power feeds did run hot that night, breaker replacement says as much, but the scorched geometry doesn't obey the feed layout. It obeys the mounts. 3 feet from the worst scar, the floor looks bored. That's the tell. Electrical chaos doesn't respect borders that cleanly. A lateral impulse dumping through a handful of bolts does. Our materials guy took a micro-hardness tester to the zone and logged a gradient that fades with distance from one anchor point. He shrugged and said, "Something yanked." Engineers don't like that verb. Floors aren't supposed to feel tugs. We found a janitor who worked nights that month. He didn't want his name on tape. He did want to talk about his mop. It slid funny, he said. Not like the grout lines. Like the head wanted to go east. I thought the floor was waxed wrong. He said it lasted a week, then stopped. He wasn't in the room during the run. He was in there after, swabbing a memory the slab hadn't finished releasing. Human senses get dismissed in labs. But when a stranger describes the same vector the fractures point to, you stop rolling your eyes. There's a photo set somebody took for insurance. It lives in a dusty folder with the word maintenance on the tab and the year misfiled by one. In those frames, you can see hairline crescents sketched around two pads like ripples after a toss. At first glance, you want to blame a pallet jack, but the crescents sit under the shadow of the machine's footprint, not in a path a forklift would take, and the timing stamp matches the missing week. If you squint, you see one more thing, a faint soot trail veering toward the east wall, pausing, and fading where the isolation feet were replaced. We checked the anchors themselves. 2 bolts show galling that doesn't belong to torque. Threads look rubbed, not torn. A lab report on the collar's notes, localized heating not attributable to uniform friction. Translation, hot in stripes. Stripes are what you get when a field walks a path, not when a wrench slips. The collars, mu metal layered, show a discoloration band that mirrors the arcs in the slab. You can read the energy's route like a map. If this were vibration, the residue would tell a different story. You'd see spalled concrete where a harmonic shook a foot loose, chips where a plate chattered, cracks radiating from corners. Instead, the fractures align. The scorch arcs lean. The bubble in a contractor's level wandered east, not diagonally across joints. The mounting geometry and the damaged geometry shake hands. That handshake doesn't happen by chance. There's one more oddity. Along the east wall, 5 feet up, the paint shows faint stippling you don't notice until you drag light across it. The stipples form a low arc, as if a fine dust lifted and then kissed the paint in a hurry. The safety officer's note about removing watches and rings lands here. If the room briefly changed how metal behaved in a band, even a thin one, debris would move in unhelpful ways. A pen doesn't have to fly to be wrong. It just has to slide, then pepper a wall with proof it took a route it never takes. We aren't claiming a smoking crater. We're pointing at fingerprints. The slab keeps secrets badly. It records direction, not motive. Everything points east through the mounts. Everything whispers the same phrase. The force you wanted went somewhere else. And if the room remembers, the power that fed it should have screamed. So we followed the electricity. Power profile, the night the grid blinked. If the slab whispered, the power system raised its voice. Utility logs don't care about NDAs. They track watts, VARs, and the moments when a campus pulls more than it should. On the night the wrench slid and the floor took a bruise, the meter spun a story. Reactive power swung out, dipped, and then whipsawed back like a driver overcorrecting on ice. For 6 minutes, the profile looked agitated. For 6 seconds, it looked wrong. Start with frequency. Generators hate being surprised. The campus cogen plant recorded a 3% sag at 207, a droop that says something leaned on the system hard and fast. Then a compensator kicked, overshot, and settled like a breath after a sprint. There's a maintenance ticket the next morning for a breaker swap, exact part number we saw in procurement. The note in the margin, contacts scored, heat signature inconsistent with rated load. That's shop speak for. It got hotter than the math says it should have. Engineers write their panic as neatly as their plans. In a binder that survived 3 purges, someone penciled, Q factor runaway at 0.68, kill sequence failed once. Q is the letter that ruins quiet labs. High Q means energy loops with low losses. It's how you build beautiful filters. It's also how you build unplanned amplifiers if your structure becomes part of the circuit. A runaway there can yank VARs like a thief, bending reactive power into places the grid doesn't expect. The anchor machine wasn't just pulling current, it was tuning the room. Line monitors captured a hiccup you only see when big inductances start arguing. Phase angles drifted. The power factor slid off unity as if the load became momentarily springy. That word, springy, isn't poetic, It's what the math says when your load stores energy elastically instead of eating it steadily. The campus saw a sudden appetite for reactive support, the kind you get when capacitors and inductors start a dance you didn't choreograph. Someone in facilities left us a gift, a strip chart scan from a recorder they never digitized. The needle gets jumpy right at the timestamp that matches the missing week's midnight entries. You can see a puff of VARs disappear, rebound, then oscillate twice before damping. 2 cycles. That's not a motor tripping. That's a tuned system brushing resonance and letting go because somebody finally ripped the plug out by hand. The technician's blister has a waveform. Meanwhile, the power quality logs from the utility side flagged a transient they labeled customer-side anomaly, likely capacitive event. They aren't wrong. Banks of caps lived in that bay, fat cans meant to shape and snub. But the shape of the event doesn't look like a single capacitor dump. It looks like a whole network breathing, then choking. It also left a bruise on a feeder upstream, tiny but there. You don't see upstream bruises unless energy tried to walk back against its leash. Here's where it lines up with NASA Marshall's old headaches. During the Delta G replication days, internal notes fretted about coherence bands, making rotor rigs draw reactive power in bursts. Not constant hum, pulses when the field alignment snapped into place. Anchoring a rotating superconductor to a bus creates loops inside loops. If Anchor found a band around 0.68 phase coherence, the grid would have felt it like a drummer adding a beat where silence should be. Our logs show that beat. There's an odd entry in a night shift work order. Check ground straps in Bay C, felt hum through rail. Ground rails don't hum unless current is walking skins in ways grounds aren't built to invite. The hum note sits a minute before the frequency sag. Meanwhile, a separate digital meter registered a zero crossing jitter, microseconds but measurable. That's not a grid on a calm night. That's a lab pushing a system to the lip. We chased a rumor about flicker complaints. In the building next door, a grad student wrote in a forum post that the lights winked twice that winter around 2 in the morning. He thought it was the HVAC kicking. The timestamps he guessed at land inside the strip chart danced. When the campus coughed, the fluorescence spoke. The control sequence mattered. The staged ramp we saw in procedures meant motors spun before the bus woke. Motors alone don't draw this footprint. When the bus slid into coherence, the reactive demand surged. Then the kill didn't take. Kill here if kill fails, the hand-soldered board note said. It failed once. They went to metal. The power record answers that with a fast cliff followed by a wobble. Software hesitates. Humans don't. There's a forward echo we can't ignore. In 2026, an aerospace test many states away logged a near-identical power signature. Brief sag, overshoot, VAR oscillation. During a propulsion run a contractor later described offhand as chasing inertial bias. On paper, unrelated. In waveform, cousins. Anchor's Q surge shows up like a fingerprint 3 decades later. The stakes weren't abstract. A Q runaway in the wrong band can cascade a campus. Trip a feeder, kill cooling, wreck a cryo, and you go from weird physics to a fire truck in 8 minutes. The safety officer knew. Extra extinguishers weren't paranoia. They were math with red handles. When the grid blinked, the room proved it could talk to the building. The building blinked back. Follow the electricity long enough, and you stop asking if something happened. You start asking who walked in the next morning with a directive not to leave a digital trail. The power system already wrote one. The safety officer's notes: don't rotate past 0.7. He wasn't a theorist. He was the guy who walked rooms before other people did and counted ways a day could go wrong. His notebook is thin, dog-eared, and more honest than any memo. First page, a hand-drawn ladder of steps, staged ramp, stabilize, wake bus, watch phase, hold below 0.7. In the margin, don't rotate past 0.7. Underline twice. No unit. Then he adds what everyone else was scared to write. Phase, not RPM. He'd borrowed language from Marshall's hard lessons. You can see delta G haunt the margins, rotor overspeed postmortems, coherence band caution, Q runaway modes. Next to each term is a fix translated into action. Add snubbers, detune at band, manual abort installed. The verbs matter. He never wrote consider. He wrote do. He spent money out of his own pocket. 2 extra fire extinguishers show up on a receipt clipped to a page with a sketch of the bay. Little excess near the exit and the control cabinet. On a separate slip, a hardware store line for a panic bar kit. He installed a second exit latch where code didn't ask for one. He drew a tiny star beside the door and added, "Prop open during phase tests." Not fear, pattern recognition. Here's the detail that reads like foresight. Remove watches, rings. He writes under a checklist labeled pre-energize. He could have said pinch hazard like most shop forms do. He didn't. He wrote field interaction, conductive loops. He'd watched brass keyrings tingle near big coils before. He didn't need a white paper to tell him skin, metal, and moving fields make bad company. He translated worry into choreography. The staged ramp is numbers and timing at first, motor frequency up to target while the bus stays asleep. Pause. Verify mechanicals. Then, and only then, bring the bus in at a shallow slope. He left a note to the tech crew. Speak values out loud. It sounds silly until you remember what panic does to math. Saying 0.66 into a room keeps fingers from pushing to 0.70 because silence got impatient. He argued with software and pencil. Next to the automated kill block diagram, he drew a fat arrow to a toggle and wrote, "Manual here if software interrupts." On another page, he taped a Polaroid of the board with a torn label, K1 kill. In marker, he'd scrawled test weekly. Under that, test with gloves off. He wasn't cavalier. He just knew relays that never get touched die politely when you need them loud. He kept a section titled after. It's 5 lines. Power down sequence slow. Ground rails check. Isolation feed inspect. Log human sensations. Then alone on a line. If hum persists in rail, suspend operations. That rail hum note shows up in the power logs a minute before the sag. He was listening with his hands long before the meters told stories. He read the room like a body. Smell bearings, he wrote, half joke, half directive. Heat writes its own scent. He added ozone with a question mark, then remove people, ventilate, recheck phase drift residual. You can picture him walking the concrete, sniffing the air, tapping the slab with his boot, deciding whether a day had ended clean. His procedures echoed the 6-second ceiling. If threshold event detected, abort within 6s. No dithering. He drew a box around the number, boxed it again, then turned it into a chant. 6 seconds or we don't run. Underneath, a simpler line, count. He'd trained crews on flashovers and arc faults. He knew how time melts. Counting is primitive on purpose. He knew about bleed without the math. Anchor into mounts with mu-metal collars, he wrote. Recheck torque post-phase. Then a caution. Vector bleed paths likely through bolts. Expect lateral load transfer. He'd never published that sentence. He wrote it to warn the next pair of hands not to trust symmetry. When the mounts discolored in stripes, the note stopped looking like paranoia and started reading like a roadmap. His fear showed in ergonomics. He angled the manual kill toward the exit and taped the handle to stiffen the throw. Gloves catch, he wrote. Cut fingertips for dexterity. On the final page before the crisis run, there's a smudge where his thumb must have rested often. Next to it, anchor, 3C only. Earlier coils retired. That single line confirms a lineage none of the sanitized files admit out loud. The last entry before the night the grid blinked is short. Pre-check complete. Phase limit set 0.68. Crew briefed, 6-second ceiling. Watches, rings removed. Doors propped. Then, almost an aside, pray bearings hold. His handwriting tightens on that last word. Prayer isn't policy. It's the moment a safety officer who's seen rooms go loud admits he can't engineer every edge. After the night, his tone changes. Kill sequence failed once. Manual effective. Burn to palm, treat. Then a decision in plain letters. External custody recommended. He isn't the one who makes extraction calls, but he records the fact like a witness planting a flag. He'd kept people alive in a room that tried to slide. He'd bought seconds with procedures and stubbornness. And when those seconds ran out, he wrote the one sentence that mattered most to him. We didn't rotate past 0.7. It found us anyway. The Vanishing, 3 engineers, 1 drive, 0 goodbyes. The night after the grid blinked, the lab looked like a room that had bitten its tongue. Cables coiled. The bay swept. A clipboard hung crooked with a fresh page on top and nothing written on it. What stood out were the timestamps. Keycards pinged until 2:13 a.m., 3 names in tight succession. Engineer, lead, safety, and then silence. No exit scans. No dawn entries. Just a line that ends mid-step. Families woke to bureaucracy. A wife found a letter in a thin envelope that said reassignment to temporary duty. No location specified. Standard benefits in abeyance pending review. It wasn't written like grief. It read like policy. Phones rang into full voicemail boxes. The center switchboard forwarded to an HR office that couldn't spell the project name because, officially, it wasn't a project. Microstories expose more than memos. The lead's desk was emptied, so clean you could see where a mug used to leave a ring. In the center of the blotter sat a yellow post-it in a hand we recognize from checklists. 7 out of 10, not October 10th. It looked like a performance note until you hear the technician admit he overshot 0.71 after an abort order. 7 out of 10 safe choices. Not 10. We don't know if that was guilt, a tally, or a warning to anyone who might pick up his pencil next. Across town, a daughter checked the mail and found a postcard with a photograph of a lighthouse washed in gray rain. No return address. The handwriting was her father's, small and tidy. You'll know when the rain feels lighter. She turned it over 3 times, felt ridiculous, then slid it into a frame on her dresser because keeping it in a drawer made it feel like a secret. It would take months before anyone noticed the acrostic spell coordinates down the left edge of the lines. Back at the lab, the safety officer's locker held his spare boots and an empty ring dish. He'd preached rings off, he lived like it. In the top tray, a folded note. EXT custody advised. Not addressed. Not initialed. Just a phrase he'd written in the notebook after the burn on his palm stopped stinging. He knew where nights like that end. Not in staff meetings, but in rooms with no windows and names you don't repeat in cafeterias. Someone did one more kindness. The control cabinet's main breaker was tagged out by a hand that took time to fold the tag's wire cleanly. The tag date is the same Saturday the emails told everyone to stop transmitting data. That means 2 things lived at once: tidy shutdown and sudden silence. Order and absence shaking hands. The extraction didn't look like a raid. Security cameras had gaps you could drive a truck through, and during the missing week, they were under maintenance. But the manual log tells you enough. 2 consultants the night of the crisis. 1 more signature the afternoon after. Same tidy penmanship, same not in the directory names. A coffee order in the cafeteria chits shows 3 black, no sugar, charged to a code that routes to no department. The cashier says they didn't bring back the trays. It's a tiny rudeness. It's also a tell. People who aren't coming back don't bust their own tables. By Monday, the offices were reassigned. The name placards were slid out and set in a drawer. The IT tickets pulled email forwards and archived drives. 1 drive didn't get archived. It went for a walk. 7 months later, a gym locker bank at a bus depot coughed up a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tape. Inside, a hard drive with a label half peeled. Checksum dates that lived back in the 199s, and a file tree that read like the last words of a team who knew their voices were about to be erased. The dead drop wasn't random. The locker rental had been paid cash by a man in work boots and a baseball cap. The number typed into the keypad shows up twice on the lead engineer's union paperwork as his daughter's birthday. The kind of breadcrumb you only leave if you pray the right person finds it first. The envelope also carried a 1-page printout, black text on white, no letterhead. Anchor 3C. Share math, not names. Whoever wrote that sentence set the boundaries of the rest of this story. The families tried to pry answers loose with politeness, and then with lawyers. The replies stayed the same. Pending. Sensitive. Under review. A benefits clerk quietly warned one spouse that pushing too hard could delay everything further. This is how pressure works when it's legal. It doesn't threaten. It pauses. It invites you to get tired. What nobody knew at the time was how quietly the team had been ghosted before they disappeared. Conference travel pulled. Project distributions thinned. Lunches shortened and held in corners. One colleague said he saw the lead staring at his hands like he was checking for ink after a pen exploded. When you run a room that moves sideways for 6 seconds, the world doesn't feel quite plumb again. We asked the technician why the 3 left the way they did. He said a choice was offered with a straight face. Cooperate and be relocated. Resist and be prosecuted under statutes with names you don't want read out in a courtroom. He believed the lead bargained for one thing, that the math wouldn't die with their payroll records. The drive proved somebody kept that promise. Inside the bay, the machine waited like an outline after someone erased the drawing. Cable trays empty. Isolation feet new. A faint striping along the mu-metal collars that wouldn't wash off with solvents. The kind of residue that says, an effect passed through here, then left. 3 engineers followed it out of the building. 0 goodbyes. 1 drive. The drive, schematics, logs, and the equation that shouldn't exist. The parcel looked like a prank until we powered it. Old SATA hiss, directory tree like a spine. No intro letter, no manifesto. Just folders named like any engineering server circa the 199s. CAD test underscore logs, video underscore error, DOS underscore notes. Checksums in the metadata matched dates from before USB sticks were party favors. You don't forge that without leaving fingerprints. This felt like a hand reaching forward 3 decades to say, start here. Open CAD first. The models were meticulous, not pretty. Ring diameters stepped across versions, bus cross-sections thickened through BREVs, and an anchor, 3C assembly drawing finally ties the frame, the phase cage, and the feed layout into one angry jigsaw. Exploded views carry vendor tags that line up with the Shell LLC's purchases. A tiny call-out circles a Mu-metal collar and labels it Rev D, exactly where the floor scars lean. If you're hiding bait, you don't bother to line up scorch arcs with drawing notes. Test underscore logs is where the room exhales. CSVs named in the way stressed teams name files. YNCH3C underscore run underscore 12 underscore final dot CSV, then final 2 when they tempt fate. Columns for motor RPM, bus current, coil temp, and 3 channels that matter most. Phase underscore COH, load underscore cell underscore drift, and lateral underscore alert. At 2 hours 7 minutes and 14 seconds, phase underscore COH crosses 0.67. 2 seconds later, load underscore cell underscore drift swings negative 0.3%, then 0.5%, and lateral underscore alert throws a 1. A note field populated by a human reads, pen moved. It's not dramatic prose. It's a lab voice trying to stay calm. Overlay the runs, and a shape emerges. Nothing happens below 0.64, noise above 0.72 because nobody stayed there long. The island in between lights up. Drift ramps nonlinearly between 0.67 and 0.71. Not a smooth slope. A knee. A tell that says the machine walked into a band of behavior the equations hadn't fully fenced. We plotted it against power input and rotor speed, expecting to crush it with a confounder. The band ignores RPM. It tracks phase. Video underscore error is all elbows and blur. CRT black bars, interlaced ghosts, a wrench edge catching light before it kisses the bay. 6 seconds is a lifetime in a lab and a punchline in video. But you hear the room. The chiller roar, then that quiet that technicians describe and microphones barely catch. The laterals don't whoosh. They show up as tiny scrapes, rubber mat, metal edge. The faintest ring as something touches paint you've already seen stippled on the wall. DOC underscore notes holds the human salt. PDFs of scanned paper, pages that smell like toner even through a screen. A margin doodle that matches the lead engineer's hand. A looping lowercase p, a squared off s. Sketches a field line bowing around the phase cage and arrows bleeding into a bolt path. Under it, bleed at mounts block? That doodle is the fingerprint the technician recognized when we slid the printout across the table. He didn't need the math to tell him what his hand had already learned yanking a lever. And then the file with a name that tries too hard to be boring. mf underscore inv underscore v03.xls. Inside, sheets labeled with grim humor, tall underscore tales, sanity, and the one that matters, predict. The header reads, mass fraction. Inversion term, empirical fit. And below it lives a compact expression that relates apparent mass change to phase coherence, bus current density, and a topology factor keyed to ring geometry. It isn't anti-gravity in a cell. It's a bias, small, temperamental, and vicious about that 0.67, 0.71 band. When we pushed the drive's log data through the term, the curve hugged the drift within error bars. Not perfect, but close enough to make your stomach drop. Here's the burn. A staticky scan of a 1992 conference abstract sits pasted in a hidden sheet. Rotating superconductors, Podkletnov, circled. Next to it, a handwritten note. Bulk versus bus, coherence route. They'd been reading the early claims, not to copy them, but to route around the parts that broke reputations. Where Podkletnov spun a disk and hoped perfection would arrive, Anchor pumped phase through a bus and looked for the band that would answer back. A second workbook, topo underscore bias underscore 2.xlsx, cross-references mf underscore inv underscore v03 with geometries the CAD proves they built. In the comments, someone writes, if term is real, payload effective mass changes with drive, not propellant. Reframe mass fraction. That sentence reads like treason in aerospace. Cell D14 flashes a simple check. Does the term predict the knee? Yes, when phase coherence enters the 0.68 corridor. That's the corridor that cracked mounts and burned a palm. We chase provenance like our lives depended on it. File system timestamps align with the missing week and the day after. The checksum history shows edits before the email that froze transmissions. Embedded usernames match the 3 who vanished and 1 junior who transferred out a month prior. No typos in the same places across sheets. Human pattern. Not a deep fake. The hook forward lives in a folder labeled references with 3 PDFs redacted into near silence. One title, barely visible under black, includes the phrase Topology-Induced inertial bias. Date stamp, 2026. The abstract stub that survived says propellantless drive concepts and cites predecessor mass inversion formulations. A breadcrumb laid on purpose or a warning. Either way, someone wanted us to see the math survive. If you plant bait, you plant spectacle. There's no spectacle here. Just coil wind densities to the gram per meter, cryo windows underlined because a hiccup cost them a run, and that number, 14.3 kilohertz, threaded like string through everything that worked and everything that hurt. The drive reads like a diary written by people who knew they were out of time. We closed the lid and sat with one ugly thought. Whoever dropped this wanted the equations to outlive the names. Not to prove a miracle on YouTube. To make sure the next team that wanders into the 0.68 band has a map, a limit, and a 6-second ceiling tattooed into their procedures. Replication attempts. The machine can vanish. What worked, what hurt. The math doesn't. If Anchor was a ghost story, it wouldn't leave fingerprints in other labs. But the first place we checked wasn't a hangar. It was a university machine room that smells like acetone and student stress, where a faculty lead decided to build a subscale coil for materials characterization. That's how you say curiosity out loud without inviting a safety review. They borrowed from old Marshall Delta G literature for procedures, staged ramp, call values, manual kill mocked up from a lathe stop, and wound a coil that matched Anchor's bus geometry in miniature. They didn't chase lift first. They chased symmetry. The rig sat under a small load cell and over a bearing stack rated laughably high for the mass on it. The first runs were noise. Then they dialed phase toward a narrow window while watching a strip chart emulator they wrote the night before. Around 0.66, a grad student said the numbers felt floaty. He got laughed at. At 0.68, the bearing load ticked down 1%, then a hair more. The load cell drifted into the noise, came out, and kissed the same number 3 runs in a row. That's when their PI underlined 14.3 kilohertz on the whiteboard and told them nobody tweets in that room. What worked was boring. A slow slope into phase. A bus that was a better listener than the rotor. A cryo window, so tight they babysat valves like NICU nurses. And just like the Anchor logs, the effect ignored rotor RPM in the band and obsessed over phase. A notebook recorded bearing unload, unexplained. You don't write unexplained, unless you're daring yourself not to draw an arrow to a word you can't publish. What hurt arrived the next week. They got greedy and let phase breathe past 0.69. The lateral force didn't shove, it leaned. A screwdriver rolled off a mat, paused like it wasn't sure which way was down, then scooted east. The motor complained. A smell announced itself, hot varnish and warm steel. They killed, but not before a student went pale and sat down hard. He described the room like a pressure change you feel in your teeth. Nausea passed after a minute. He didn't come back for phase days. A private tinkerer, working out of a rented warehouse, watched our first video and decided to build his own ring. He posted photos like a proud parent, Inconel carrier, bus wind that would have made the anchors nod. He ran up motor speed, then nudged a function generator into a phase dance. His story is a mirror in cheaper metal. At 0.68, a socket on the floor spun in place a quarter turn, his drill press quivered, and his motor drove itself hotter than his power budget could handle. He aborted late because he hadn't built a manual that cared. The next frame he posted was a scorched stator and a caption that just said spooked. Here's the pattern, across careful and reckless. The band is narrow and mean. Effects cluster right at 0.68, get playful near 0.69, and punish you when you flirt with 0.70. More than one rig logged vector bleed, in plain language after tools crept toward the east wall. In every case, aborts right at 0.70 prevented damage. Over 0.70, things broke. Bearings unloaded in ugly steps. Mounts chattered. One lab's cube of mu metal showed a discoloration ring the PI swore he'd never seen on shielding that wasn't abused. We pushed one more check through a metrology lab that only cares about numbers and can be bribed with calibration contracts. They placed high-resolution accelerometers on an isolation table beside a cold coil and fed phase from a black box they weren't allowed to open. Twice during the band, the accelerometers registered an upward microimpulse, tiny but in sync with the phase cue. They ran vibration contamination filters like zealots. The residual stuck around. Their report didn't say anti-gravity. It said non-inertial coupling suspected. That's how grown-ups hedge a bet when tenure is on the line. The human costs read like side effects on a prescription label nobody warns you about. Nausea near energized lattices. A metallic taste some techs swear rides in on certain harmonics. Forearms that buzz like you've leaned on a live panel, even when ground straps say you didn't. One assistant tripped a ceiling sensor with a metal clipboard because he forgot the safety officer rule about conductive loops on skin. He set it down and watched it skitter an inch toward the east wall. He didn't forget again. The safest replication we saw leaned on precedent like a crutch. Delta G-era playbooks kept fingers off fancy adjectives and on procedure. Speak values out loud. Count seconds. Pre-brief the 6-second ceiling like a fire drill. Build a manual kill you can yank with a burned hand. In that frame, small things worked predictably enough to be interesting. Outside it, people got singed. The labs that wrote us back after we shared the anchor term did something else right. They treated mass fraction inversion as a modeling nudge, not a grail. When they folded the term into their predictions, the knee showed up where the rig already bit them. The math didn't rescue them. It told them where not to stand. That's the gift anchor left, not a machine you can copy, but a warning that certain geometries, at certain rhythms, invite the world to lean sideways for 6 seconds and ask what you'll do about it. The instruments don't lie, gravimeters and accelerometers. Human memory bends. Instruments don't. So we hunted for sensors that couldn't be talked out of their own data, gravimeters and accelerometers that lived to call you a liar. The archive we needed wasn't labeled anchor. It was a dusted-off microgravity study from the same building, shelved under calibration trials. The files carried timestamps that sit inside the missing week, and one trace wore a small note. Background check, do not interpret. It overlapped the 6-second ceiling like a glove. We interpreted. For a 6-second window that overlaps the technician's count and the strip chart wobble, the gravimeter curve dips a hair, steadies in the wrong place, then returns like a rubber band snapping back. It isn't a free fall. It's a nudge. The room felt lighter by a sliver, and only in that slice of time. You check contamination first. Gravimeters hate vibration like violins hate sand. So we mapped the test bay's building rumble against the sensor's mount. The baseline hum sat quiet that night. Elevators slept. HVAC ran steady. A control channel that usually tattles on footsteps stayed flat. Then the 6 seconds arrived, and the instrument wrote a polite disagreement with the rest of physics. When we ran the data through the same filters the lab uses to erase nonsense, a residual remained, small, stubborn, synchronized with the phase band the logs call out in red. Podkletnov's shadow walks through that shape. His 1992 claims of gravity shielding live in the same family of blinks and dips, tenths of a percent that set reputations on fire. Replication attempts back then coughed up suggestive noise and raised eyebrows, not consensus. Anchor didn't repeat his geometry. It stumbled into a band where a calibrated gravimeter noticed something for 6 seconds and wrote it down without adjectives. That's the difference between rumor and instrument memory. Accelerometers gave us a second set of eyes. 2 sat on a floated isolation table, 1 aligned vertical, 1 crosstalk sentinel. They're the kind of sensors labs use to keep microscopes honest. During the phase window, the vertical channel twitched upward, micro-G range, repeatable twice, while the lateral stayed boring, except for a faint nudge east that matched the floor's lean. The techs who ran the table long after anchor left the room labeled the blip, non-inertial artifact, and moved on because that's how you keep your job. The timestamp doesn't move on. It hugs the same 6-second box. We tried to beat the data into behaving. Oversampling artifacts? We resampled. Thermal drift? The cryo loop didn't burp then, and accelerometers don't care about cold air the way coils do. Seismic noise? We overlaid a regional seismograph. The Earth yawned elsewhere that night. Motor harmonics? The accelerometer sits on a table divorced from the rotor's physical tantrums by design. Every boulder we threw at the curve slid off. The bump stayed small, stayed put, and kept the same relationship to phase coherence the load cell drift drew in its own quiet language. There's a moment in the records where a junior analyst, anonymous by file name, tries the simplest trick: time shift the gravimeter and the accelerometer blips to see if they share a heartbeat. He drags one trace a second left, a second right, then drops them so their leading edges meet. The overlap is ugly perfect. Both rise a hair late, both hold for the same rude 6, both fall like someone remembered the kill. He writes CR in a margin and closes the file. We opened it again decades later and didn't need the question mark. Skeptics push on coupling. Could an EMI burp tickle the accelerometer? Maybe, but the gravimeter lives in a different church. It measures the local G field by reference to a delicate mass and a heartbeat of Earth. You don't spoof that with a stray wire unless you're careless enough to drape it over the instrument, and nobody with a badge in that room made that kind of amateur hour mistake. Besides, the phase match matters. The dip didn't happen at spin-up or bus wake or any of the boring times. It sat right on the .67, .71 island the drive logs circled with a highlighter. We circled back to vocabulary because words steer budgets. The safer phrase in the documents is apparent mass shift. Not anti-gravity, not levitation. A measurement that says a load felt briefly different to instruments that don't share myths. The anchor term, mass fraction inversion, lives here quietly. If local inertia is being biased by topology and timing, your propellant math starts to look negotiable in tiny, ruthless ways. That's not a promise. It's a pattern. There's humility in the traces. No pens orbiting the ceiling for minutes. No bowling balls floating under tarps. Just 6-second windows where gravity's metronome skipped a beat, and a lab that knew enough to write down the time, the phase, and the fact that filters couldn't scrub it away. The accelerometers didn't hoot, they cleared their throats. The gravimeter didn't shout, it sighed. So we believe the instruments the way sailors believe wake trails. They don't tell you why the ship passed. They tell you that it did, and which way it leaned. Our wake points to a narrow band, a sideways whisper, and a ceiling you count out loud. And if the sensors heard it, someone else did too. The watchers with badges that don't scan and notebooks that don't live on servers. The watchers, black badges, and the quiet extraction. Security never writes poetry, but their silences rhyme. The week the slab leaned east, cameras in the bay developed a selective amnesia. Maintenance tickets sprouted like mushrooms. Lens alignment, encoder faults, intermittent video loss, all stamped inside the missing week. On a normal night, the corridors stitched themselves into a timeline. That week, whole hallways went blank. Meanwhile, the manual log sprouted unfamiliar names in the same tidy hand. Consultant, consultant, consultant. Not a company, not a directorate, just a word that means don't ask. We pulled a badge audit from a sympathetic admin who hates mysteries. The database spat out an error on 2 IDs that pinged the outer door after midnight Saturday. Credential not found. That message doesn't mean the card failed. It means the server wasn't allowed to know who the card belonged to. At the same minute, the spiral notebook by the door welcomed 3 careful signatures the org chart can't claim. The technician remembers their jackets. Dark, no logos. They moved like people who'd walked labs before, not like suits cosplaying competence. Across campus, the cafeteria worked a late shift for the janitorial crew. A cashier we'll call Lena remembers 3 men at 1:30 a.m., black coffee, no sugar, calm as a checklist. They carried themselves like travelers between terminals. Eyes up, shoulders relaxed, no hurry. She rang a cost code the register accepted, then watched them leave trays by the door. It stuck with her because everyone in that building busses their own. People who won't be back don't learn the habits. Meanwhile, an unmarked sedan idled in a fire lane on the loading side of the test building from 2 to 2:20. The guard on the midnight desk logged it as vendor pickup, then crossed out vendor and wrote after-hours transport. The plate runs to a fleet pool that answers to a P.O. box inside an agency whose acronym never appears in campus newsletters. The driver wore a ball cap and didn't show ID because the guard already knew better than to ask twice. Motive lives in the paperwork shadowing these nights. A custodial work order appears Monday for office turnover, 3 cubicles. HR tickets auto-generate reassignment placeholders with no destinations. IT kills forwarding rules and locks mailboxes under a retention hold. None of those systems know physics. They know when someone higher up wants a name to stop appearing on calendars. While that happens, the lab door grows new signs. One reads under maintenance, Another reads restricted. They both tell the truth. We found a threat assessment memo in a folder that shouldn't have survived. It's stamped pre-decisional, which is bureaucrat for we're about to make a mess. The memo lays out 3 risks in the same breath. Strategic disruption to satellite deployment if mass apparent shifts scale, spoofing of inertial navigation if lateral bleed can be shaped, and market chaos if energy systems can bias load in ways grids can't price. It uses one sentence to instruct whoever holds anchor. Contain, compartmentalize, deny. That's a recipe card, not a debate. The consultants didn't walk into debate. They came to claim custody. The technician remembers a question they asked no one in his building had ever phrased out loud. Is there any record of a lift event exceeding 6 seconds? He answered, yes. One of them wrote on a pad without looking up, external review recommended. They didn't threaten. They didn't need to. The 6-second ceiling had already become a countdown clock in every memo that mattered. A second badge anomaly popped the next afternoon. A maintenance door keyed open from the inside by a master punch that logs to nowhere. That door leads to a service corridor, a stairwell, and a loading bay that shares walls with rooms where people sign different NDAs. The cameras facing that hallway were undergoing calibration. The only timestamp we have is the truck rental receipt. 2 pallet spaces, billed to a Shell LLC that dissolved after paying hazard bonuses. The manifest reads equipment lab. The driver wrote fragile like a joke. We tracked one of the black badge. Men by a habit. He prints his block letters with a flat-topped A. The same A signs the manual log, a visitor slip in a neighboring building, and a checkout card for an EMI sniffer that left the tool crib that night and never came back. It's a small vanity, letters always betray their writers. It also ties a path, into the bay, out with paper, across to a room where people copy hard drives and hand them to men with sedans. The extraction wasn't cinematic. It was a sequence. Outsiders enter under the cover of maintenance. Digital records freeze. Physical logs grow euphemisms. Families receive letters that read like weather reports. By the time anyone asks questions, the answers have been typed into memos that say sensitive and pending, 2 words that move time like molasses. The only voice that spoke plainly that night belonged to the safety officer's notebook, external custody recommended. He'd understood the room wasn't the only thing with vectors. Power, names, equations, each would bleed if you didn't collar them. And yet, the math walked. Someone inside that quiet extraction tucked a drive into a route the watchers didn't watch. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens when a condition is negotiated behind a closed door. The machine goes dark, the team goes quiet, the equations don't die. The black badges knew why Anchor couldn't exist publicly. They also knew what mattered to the men they were escorting out of their own lives. So they lifted 3 chairs from a lab, loaded a machine that would be dismantled by hands with better gloves, and left a breadcrumb that points to a lighthouse in the rain. Threat memo, why Anchor couldn't exist publicly. The memo wasn't stamped top secret. It didn't need the theater. Pre-decisional sat in the corner like a shrug that hides a knife. The title was dry, Threat Assessment, Anchor Class Phenomena. It cited Podkletnov, 1992, the Delta G experience at NASA Marshall, and treated vector bleed and mass fraction inversion as risks, not buzzwords. Inside, the sentences stopped pretending. First, satellites. They wrote it in the language of orbits and insurance. If a system can bias apparent mass, even fractionally, you can alter deployment profiles without propellant. A 6-second window at insertion could turn a marginal ride share into a perfect drop. That sounds like a gift until you realize whose hands get to hold it. If one nation shapes gravity's grip by timing and topology, every other launch becomes a guess. Strategic asymmetry was their phrase. The industry would call it panic. Then navigation. The memo's author lingered on the phrase lateral impulse leakage. Our vector bleed, like someone who's seen gyros argue with the world. Modern missiles and aircraft trust inertial systems to know which way is home when everything else is jammed. If you can manufacture a sideways nudge inside the right envelope, you can push a platform's idea of down a hair off true. Spoof it repeatedly, and a guidance solution walks itself into missed distance. They didn't say weaponize gravity. They said bias inertia. The effect Anchor hated might be a feature to people who don't fix floors for a living. Energy markets came next. Not perpetual motion. Not magic. Just the ugly economics of a grid that can't price a device that shifts load invisibly. If a machine can make a mass seem lighter to itself for 6 seconds, pulsed right, You change how rotating machines spin, how storage banks fill, how you arbitrage everything from frequency regulation to peak shaving. The memo walked right up to the line and didn't cross it. Topology-induced inertial bias could distort market operations. Translation: if this leaks while half-baked, you get scams. If it lands mature and classified, you get monopolies. Academia got a paragraph with teeth. The writer knew the culture. Public gravity breakthroughs are reputationally radioactive. Debunking keeps careers safe. It also keeps money where oversight can reach it. The memo recommended a posture that fit like a glove on everything we'd seen. Contain, compartmentalize, deny. 3 words, 3 steps. Keep it in a box. Split the box into boxes. Tell the world the boxes are empty. One line nodded at Podkletnov without saying his name. Historical claims have produced significant media noise and institutional cost without operational payoff. The subtext: we paid once. We won't pay again. The NASA Marshall Delta G years lived in that sentence like a ghost. The Delta G postmortems had warned about coherence bands, Q runaways, and reputations that never came home. Anchor's band sat on the same number line. The memo folded that history into a reason to keep mouths shut. Then the rulebook. Data handling. Do not transmit over networked systems. We'd seen that in the Sunday 122 email. Physical custody. Transfer to external review. We'd watched that happen in the dark with a sedan and a missing EMI sniffer. Public posture, no acknowledgement, no. Correction, no comment. That's why the cafeteria story mattered. It's the only place anyone left a human crumb. In the documents, they don't even dignify Anchor with a capital A. They appended scenarios. One imagined a leak, videos of a wrench scooting, charts with a knee at 0.68, and weighed the cost of calling it a hoax versus letting it hang. Silence preferable to engagement. Engagement invites discovery. Silence breeds doubt. Doubt keeps grants flowing to problems with friendlier names. Another scenario gamed adversary progress. If someone else converged on the mass fraction inversion term, what then? Acquire, mirror, redirect. It reads like advice for a con. By the startup, copy the math, bury the brand. The 2026 white paper stub in our drive, Topology-Induced Inertial Bias, looked less like coincidence and more like the script leaving the page. There's a paragraph only safety officers would underline. Operational risk, uncontrolled resonance can propagate beyond test bay. Cryogenic failure cascade likely at Q runaway. That's the campus fire truck math. The memo wasn't blind to the room's ability to hurt the building. It simply weighed that hurt against the cost of a world where anyone could build a phase gate from a parts list and a dream. Buried at the end sat the sentence that told us how the men vanished without goodbye. Personnel disposition, onboarding to compartmented program or reassignment under standard non-disclosure with benefits restoration contingent. That's a velvet threat and a real choice. Pensions if you play along. Statutes if you don't. It closed with a recommendation that read like a verdict. Anchor class phenomena must not exist publicly. Not should not. Must not. The justification was clean. National security, market stability, academic continuity. The memo never said curiosity. It never said wonder. It never said the word that put a blister on a palm. So yes, the watchers had motive. Not to steal a miracle, but to keep a pattern from ripping threads they care about. They saw 6 seconds of wrong and wrote policy. The machine would vanish, the people would be moved, and the math would live where badges don't beep. What they didn't plan for was a postcard, a locker, the postcard and a rain kept a lighthouse cryptographic frame. The lighthouse photo wasn't the message. The lines were. First letters stacked down the left margin spelled out numbers separated by slashes. Her birthday as a decoy, then a latitude and longitude if you read the slashes as decimals. We checked the daughter's frame. She'd never noticed the acrostic. She'd just dusted it like a promise. The coordinates didn't land on a base. They landed on a weather station at a coastal test range. Civilian-facing, military-adjacent, the kind of place that logs raindrops like gossip. We pulled the terminal velocity records for the week the grid blinked. One entry tripped our teeth. Droplets recorded falling slower than the model. No wind shear to blame. Instrument self-check passed. The note in the margin, odd stratification, reads like a forecaster refusing to say gravity felt strange. We lined timestamps. The rain anomaly sits inside the same night window as the manual logs, the utility sag, the 6-second microgravity dip. Not proof, alignment. Still, the signature felt familiar. A brief bias that didn't care about thunderheads, only timing. We visited the station. The tech remembered that weird drizzle, the way mist hung heavier above the dunes and then seemed to ease by a hair, like a breath. He pointed to a rack mount box with a faded inspection sticker. We swapped nothing, he said. It fixed itself. Back home, the daughter ran her finger over the lighthouse glass. She asked if he was alive when he wrote it. We told her the card was a breadcrumb, not a goodbye. She nodded like someone counting to 6. Confrontation, presenting the evidence to the technician. We didn't meet him in a lab. We met him in a garage that smelled like oil and old wood, with a drill press older than both of us humming in the corner. He'd already seen our emails and ignored the first 3. The 4th mentioned a margin doodle. He called 5 minutes later and said, "Bring it. Don't bring a camera." We slid the printout across his workbench. Dios_notes, the page with the looping P and squared S, a field line bowing around the phase cage, arrows bleeding into a bolt path. He didn't touch it. He leaned over, squinted, and let out a breath he didn't know he'd held. "That's him," he said. "No name. Just a finger tapping the arrow to the mount." He drew that after the first time the pen moved. Then we opened the CAD. Anchor, 3C assembly. He didn't need the title block. His thumb landed on a collar callout. Rev D, right where the floor scars had leaned. "They changed that twice," he said. "First one rang. Second one cracked." He smiled without humor. "Third one a left stripes." He traced the frame with his fingernail until he hit the coil. A photo from the drive sat beside the drawing, mislabeled in a way that had bothered us for a week. 3B_coil.jpg. He shook his head. "No, that's 3C. We wrapped the bus tighter there. See the bind mark? We only nicked it once." He found the nick without looking. He wanted the logs next. We brought up ENCH3C_run_12_final2.csv, the one where phase_COH crosses 0.67, the load dips, the lateral throws a 1, and somebody typed "pen moved." He read the header, then the numbers, then the little human note. "That's mine," he said quietly. We were trying not to say float. We were trying not to say anything that would make us stupid if anyone ever read it. I asked about the 6-second box. He nodded slow. It wasn't superstition. It was a lid. If you didn't put a lid on it, it took you. He looked at his palm like it still stung. He counted out loud. 6, then stop. We missed by 1 once. We didn't lead with the equation. We let him ask. So what did he do with the math? We opened mf_inv_v03.xls, the tab predict, the compact expression tying apparent mass change to phase coherence, current density, and that topology factor. He didn't read the symbols first. He looked at the comment bubbles, the jokes in the sheet names, the way Sanity built fences around tall _tails. Then he found the term and stilled. "You got it that clean?" he asked. We showed him the overlay, drive logs through the term, the knee hugging 0.68 to 0.71 like it knew where to live. He tapped the knee twice with a knuckle. He used to say the room had a voice. That's what it sounded like. We asked him about the mislabeled photo again. He gave us the lineage without ceremony. 1A cracked a cage, 2A ate a bearing, 2B taught us to count, 3A was mean, 3B lied, 3C told the truth. He caught himself. "Sorry, we named them like dogs." Then the part he hadn't told anyone. He stared past us at the drill press and said, "We recorded one more run." He didn't look to see how that landed. We wrote over the directory name so a crawler wouldn't find it, like hiding whiskey behind the vinegar. The kill failed once. He pulled the lever and it stuck. We hit 0.71. It was my hand on the abort before his. He swallowed hard. I heard the hum go into my wrist. I can still hear it when I think about it. We slid the strip chart scan from facilities to the right of his memory. 2 of our pulses damping after a cliff. He nodded again, smaller. "That's the wobble. First one is the machine. Second one is me." He let a beat pass. He wanted to keep running. He wanted the map finished. I told him the map's not worth it if your shoes melt on the road. I asked about the note on the desk. 7 out of 10? He closed his eyes. 7 calls we got right that night. 3 we argued with the room. I wrote it so I'd remember I wasn't perfect. He opened them and gave a crooked grin. I hate post-its. They stick to everything except what you need. We showed him the 2026 breadcrumb, the redacted PDF title with topology-induced inertial bias, the citation that winked at predecessor mass inversion formulations. He didn't flinch. Good. That was the deal. Math walks. He let the words sit. We were not allowed names. We were allowed limits. Before we packed, he asked to see the lighthouse again. He traced the first letters with a calloused finger and shook his head like he both admired and resented the trick. He always loved acrostics, he said, almost laughing. He used to hide grocery lists like that. We thanked him and reached for the drive. He put his hand on it, not to take it, just to feel the casing. One directory's missing, he said. We taped the camera to the ceiling for that run because the tripod rattled. He lifted his eyes. You're going to find a folder that looks like a checksum backup. It isn't. It's the crisis. Don't play it loud. It makes the room feel wrong. We walked back into the day with the equation burning a hole in the bag and the technician's guilt-riding shotgun with our relief. He'd given us the lineage, the doodle's fingerprint, and a breadcrumb of his own. A missing directory with a ceiling view of 6 seconds over a line they swore they wouldn't cross. The crisis run, 6 seconds over the line. 3 days after the grid blinked, the room still smelled faintly of cooked varnish and cold metal. Procedures didn't change, voices did. They spoke softer, counted louder. The plan on the whiteboard was the same ladder the safety officer had drawn 100 times. Staged ramp, stabilize, wake bus, watch phase, hold below 0.68, count to 6 if anything twitches, and get out. They meant it when they wrote it. They also brought extra tape to hold the manual kill handles throw because the last time, it stuck. The camera didn't sit on the tripod. They'd taped it to a ceiling conduit to keep the legs from rattling. It pointed down at a rectangle of concrete, a crescent of coil, and a scatter of tools that weren't supposed to move unless hands told them to. Off frame, the technician stood by the toggle with the fat Sharpa label, K1 kill. The lead cradled a notebook against his ribs and watched the meter that mattered. The safety officer stood near the door, one hand on the prop bar he'd paid for himself. They started with breath. Motor whine came up like a curtain, no drama, just a number crossing a threshold they'd crossed 100 times. Bearings stayed quiet. The prayer didn't have to do any work yet. Bus cold, the tech said. Phase asleep. He clicked his tongue once, a habit to mark his own nerves falling into line. The lead murmured the ladders. 0.62, 0.64. The digits were lullabies. No one said float. No one said lift. They didn't give the room words to steal. At 0.66, the strip chart emulator would have called the load cell normal, if anyone had been looking. They weren't. Every eye hunted the phase readout and the kill lever's arc. The safety officer said what he always said, watches off, rings off, hands dry, and exhaled through his nose like he could push the room's static back into the walls. Waking bus, the lead said, and a low cord slid under the motor's whine. You could feel it in the cheap hairs on your arms. Coils talking to power like an old couple in the kitchen. The first wrong thing was small. The pen on the cabinet rolled a 1/4 inch toward the east wall and stopped like it remembered itself. The tech swallowed, didn't look, and kept his eyes on the numbers. 0.67, the lead said. The bus line on the digital trace softened, then sharpened, then held. Hold, the safety officer said. Count if you feel it. The floor felt like it took its own breath. They drifted into the band they'd circled in red on printouts like a border you don't cross without a stamp. 0.68, the lead said. At the same beat, the load cell dipped a hair. The kind of hair that makes a quiet man say, huh, and a loud one shut up. The tech's hand tightened on the handle. He didn't pull. Not at 0.68. Not yet. 6 seconds is a long time to be brave and a short time to be stupid. The room did the thing the logs call drift and people call lighter. A washer quivered on a bench. A socket spun in a circle as if a finger had flicked it and then forgot the joke. No one laughed. 1. The safety officer said, voice flat. 2. The lead blinked and wrote nothing. Writing makes you forget to move. At 3. A wrench edge lifted, lost its mind, and slammed sideways so fast it made a sound like a bell trying to be a cymbal. The lateral didn't shove. It leaned like a tide discovers a new moon. East. The same east that left stripes on mu-metal collars. The tech's thumb twitched on the handle. The lead shook his head a fraction. Just enough to say not yet, not with words, not with eyes anyone could accuse of saying anything. 4. The safety officer said. You could hear heat learning how to be hot inside insulation that owed them another month. Somewhere in the cabinet, a relay thought about life and decided not to. The phase readout walked up 100th and called it nothing. The room disagreed. The pen on the cabinet lifted a finger's width and hung there like it was listening. At 5, the kill sequence should have ended the debate. The tech threw the lever. It didn't throw back. The handle moved, stuck, then groaned halfway down the arc like someone had poured syrup into its joints. The bus didn't blink. The motor sang an ugly overtone. The lead's mouth made an oath he'd pretended he didn't know. "Kill stuck," the tech said. Voice even. "Eyes not." The number on the phase readout betrayed them by not sounding dramatic. .71, the lead said flat. It was a confession, not an announcement. The band that made things floaty and foolish became a strip where mounts remembered bolts or bridges. The isolation feet chattered. A hairline on the floor began to learn the letter it would one day become. The safety officer didn't count 6. He said, "Now." The tech didn't argue with physics or software. He put his shoulder into the lever like it was a stuck door between him and oxygen. The handle moved an inch, stuck again, then broke free. The room answered like a rope going slack. The bus dropped, the motor coughed, the coil sighed. 2 pulses rolled out into the rails, bars looking for anywhere to be but here, and died because the building's lungs remembered how to breathe without a hand on their throat. Somewhere in the middle of the drop, a socket that had been spinning skittered across paint and came to rest pointing east, like a compass embarrassed by its own honesty. The load cell overshot and came back, the treadmill of a number with knees. The pen fell and kissed the cabinet hard enough to leave a dot no solvent would ever quite persuade into forgetting. Silence after a room tries to go loud isn't quiet. It's diagnosis. The lead stared at the readout and didn't write. The tech looked at the burn line wrapped around his palm like a bad wedding band and flexed his fingers to see which ones still belonged to him. The safety officer looked at the door, then at the lever, then at the coil, and made a face men make when they decide to stop gambling for other people. "Kill sequence failed once," he said, voice back to being a clipboard. "Manual effective." He didn't wait for nods. "External custody recommended." The words sounded like they'd already been living in his notebook, waiting for a day to walk out. They didn't dismantle the rig that night. They tagged it. "Out," the tag said, in neat block letters none of them wrote. The camera clicked off with a tiny chirp. The technician counted to 6 anyway, because some habits aren't about phase. The lead closed the notebook that hadn't recorded the biggest decision he'd made in a decade. He put his palm on the coil casing, not to feel heat, not to say goodbye, just to check if the room was done speaking. Walking out, the safety officer paused by the rail and pressed his fingers to the steel. "No hum." He nodded to no one, killed the lights, and left the door propped one last time. In the dark, the taped conduit held a camera that had watched a promise break. Above the conduit, a ceiling that would carry a strip of scorch arcs like a bruise you only see when the sun is wrong. The crisis run wasn't heroic. It was 6 seconds over a line they swore they wouldn't cross, a lever that lied once, and 3 men who learned a room's voice the hard way. It cost a palm, a collar's color, a bearing's innocence, and the luxury of believing you can keep certain rooms out of certain conversations. It bought one sentence that would leave the bay with them: "We don't run again." And one more that would follow like a shadow: "We don't keep this." Extraction, the deal, the threat, the choice. They didn't bring handcuffs. They brought paperwork. The room was the same conference hall where budget meetings went to die, except tonight the blinds were drawn, and the air felt like a waiting room for bad news. 3 men sat on one side, lead, technician, safety officer. 2 on the other, black badges turned inward, jackets soft enough to be expensive, pens that clicked without sound. The one with the flat-topped A in his block letters opened a folder and spoke like a dentist counting. "Teeth." He started with the part that sounds kind, "You're needed." Then the part that isn't, "You're already in violation." He slid a 1 sheet across the table, bullet points marching like ants. International traffic in arms regulations. Unauthorized handling of controlled technical data. Unauthorized transmission risk. The technician stared at the word arms and thought about the lever that stuck and the heat inside his own hand. The deal had 3 doors and none of them had windows. Door 1, cooperate. Immediate reassignment to a compartmented program. Benefits restored, families stabilized, work continues under different lights. Door 2, resist. Referral to an investigation with teeth. Testimony under oath about a system you're not allowed to name. Legal bills that retirements can't carry. Door 3, talk to no one and wait for your life to be defined by pending. He didn't say the 3rd door out loud. He let the stack of papers say it with their weight. The safety officer asked the only question that mattered to him. Does the room stay dark? Meaning the bay. The machine. The nights that add up to fires unless someone knows how to count to 6. The flat-topped nodded once. Here, yes. He didn't smile. Elsewhere, no. The lead kept his hands folded, so you couldn't see the tremor. He didn't argue physics. He argued custody. If we go, he said, the math goes where? The other man's eyes didn't move. Where it belongs. The lead didn't blink. I don't care about belongs. I care about outliving. He said the word like it tasted strange. He tapped the table once with a forefinger. The equations don't die. A second folder emerged. This one carried letters already addressed in template, just waiting for names. Reassignment notices. Non-disclosure agreements with blank lines that look like open mouths. Restoration clauses for pensions with a paragraph the color of a hook. The black badge with softer edges softened his voice a fraction. Your families won't be harmed, he said, and then left a pause big enough to drive a condition through. Your cooperation is required. The technician thought of a daughter who framed a lighthouse without knowing she was keeping a map. He thought of a wife who'd learned to read his face when the world tilted. He looked at the lead and saw the man who could live in a workbook for days and still come up for air with a joke about acrostics. He looked at the safety officer's wrapped palm and knew the part of the story that would never fit on a form. The safety officer glanced at the window and found himself reflected in it. Tired, stubborn, more caretaker than scientist. He spoke last because that's his role. We don't litigate rooms. We keep people alive in them. He turned his burned hand so the badge men couldn't miss it. We'll go where this can be run without killing a janitor. But one thing goes with us. He nodded to the lead. His map. The flat-top man didn't argue. He wrote a word on his pad, condition, and drew a square around it. A copy, he said. No originals leave external custody. The lead nodded like a man agreeing to get rid of the car, but keeping the keys cast in wax. A copy, he said, and one breadcrumb. They didn't handshake. They signed. Pen scratched. Paper weighted itself with new futures. The technician initialed 6 places and felt like each letter was giving up a syllable of his name. The safety officer signed with a pressure that would have broken a cheaper ballpoint. The lead's signature looked careful, like someone solving for legibility when his mind was somewhere else entirely. The breadcrumb wasn't a metaphor in the room. It became a clause, documentation of computational models may be retained for continuity of analysis. Narrow enough to fit a file tree labeled boring, and wide enough to carry the thing that mattered most. MF_INV_V03 and its cousins. Outside the clause, a favor hung in the air, unspoken and understood. A postcard, a locker, a birthday turned into a keypad code. Proof of life, not to the world, but to one person who needed to know rain could feel lighter. The threats weren't shouted. They were calendared. A schedule slid across, pickup times, inventory of items under new custody, a list of machines that would be dismantled by other hands. You won't be present, the soft-voiced one said. You won't be consulted. The lead looked at his shoes and nodded like he was memorizing their scuffs. The technician asked, "Do we get to say goodbye?" The answer was practiced. "We recommend against any communication that could complicate your reassignment." The safety officer translated it aloud. No, they walked out not as prisoners, but as people whose routes had been drawn by someone else's pen. Past the bay, left at the vending machines, through a door that beeped differently than campus doors beep. The tech turned once in the corridor and took a mental photo of the out tag on the control cabinet, the neat wire twist nobody in. His team ever used. He wanted to be angry at the neatness. He was tired instead. The car waiting outside wasn't black or dramatic. It was beige and forgettable, the color bureaucracies favor when they move miracles. The lead got in and held his notebook like a small animal. The safety officer slid in with his burned hand turned palm up to keep pressure off the blister. The technician took the back seat by the window and watched campus lights smear into lines as the sedan rolled. He counted silently to 6 and then stopped, as if honoring a ceiling even the night couldn't hear. In the quiet between buildings and highway, the lead leaned forward and spoke to the driver without looking at him. "One request," he said. The driver glanced into the mirror but didn't answer. The lead continued anyway. "A locker. A week from now. A bus station not here." The driver didn't nod. He didn't need to. The condition already lived on a pad with a flat-top day. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't surrender. It was a negotiation with gravity's accountants. You get the machine, you get the men, you don't get to kill the math. The choice sat like a weight in the car, light enough to carry, heavy enough to leave a mark on the seat when they stood up again. Somewhere in the glove box lived a stack of forms explaining what had just happened. None of them used the word that mattered most to the three who'd signed. They didn't write promise. They wrote program. Back at the building they'd left, a custodian pulled a plastic tag from a door and thought about how often people write forever on things that last a week. A camera watched a hallway and recorded nothing. A drive slid into a pocket that would become a parcel wrapped in brown paper. A postcard sat in a rack at a gift shop by the ocean, waiting to be bought by a man with small, tidy handwriting who counted letters the way other men count steps to a door they've already decided to open. The 2026 Echo, the anomaly hiding in plain sight. The breadcrumb in the drive wasn't subtle if you knew the dialect. Topology-Induced inertial bias, redacted into a whisper, dated 2026. We went looking for its shadow in places that like to publish without being read, conference preprints that never quite reached journals, industry decks watermarked to death, and white papers parked behind NDAs with abstracts left out front like decoys. One paper kept cropping up in footnotes with its title mostly eaten by black bars. We never got the full text, we got the skeleton. Preliminary assessment of non-propellant thrust via geometry-coupled inertial fields. The surviving sentence in the abstract named a precursor term for modeling, mass fraction inversion. Our term. Their context. Different decade. The author list read like a shell game. One aerospace startup, one national lab, and a strategic partner that doesn't maintain a press page. You learn to read absence like text. Meanwhile, a power signature leaked from a test that shouldn't have left the hangar. We didn't get video. We got a maintenance report from a utility substation adjacent to an aerospace test campus, dated April 2026. Reactive power spiked during a 2-minute window, followed by a sharp cue correction the grid had to eat and burp. The waveform wears the same shape as Anchor's night. The knee, the wobble, the double pulse as a system breathes under a hand and then remembers how to stand up. Different buildings, same cough. We matched the utility time to a series of freight manifests through the campus gate. On either side of the spike, pallets labeled inertial assembly components rolled in, and 2 days later, hazardous waste left with notes about epoxy char doesn't mean exotic physics. Char means something ran hotter than it wanted to. But when you stack the char beside a grid wobble and a redacted abstract that uses your math term like a screwdriver, a line starts to draw itself without your help. Industry rumor did the rest. A startup with a name like a mood board stopped talking about ion drives and started talking about mass efficiency paths. They didn't show thrusters. They showed payload fractions on a slide that didn't add up if you only let propellant do the work. In a closed-door Q&A, a CFO type said, "Our architecture changes the denominator," and moved on. Engineers in the back looked either thrilled or nauseous. That's the face you make when someone reaches for a knob the world says doesn't exist. You don't hang meaning on rumor. You go back to the numbers. In the 2026 deck, a line chart labeled net impulse per input joule shows a family of curves that climb, flatten, then spike in a narrow band before falling off a cliff. The x-axis wears a euphemism, coherence index. If you squint at the tick marks, they're cousins to Anchor's phase readout. Vector bleed is noted as a mount issue. Mass fraction inversion is cited as a modeling aid. We overlaid the shapes from the drive, load cell drift versus phase, onto the cleaned-up deck curve. The spike sat where our knee lives. Not perfect, not identical, but close enough to make you sit forward. Language always betrays lineage. The 2026 paper's methods section, the part left unredacted by either incompetence or arrogance, uses phrases that were born in rooms like Anchor's. 6-second dwell. Lateral artifacts controlled via mount isolation. Abort at 0.70. No one writes abort at 0.70 unless they've heard what lives on the other side. That's not literature. That's a scar. We traced one author to a talk at a symposium that pretends to be about power electronics. He spoke around his topic the way you walk around a sleeping dog. We're exploring topology, he said, as a lever on inertial behavior. Someone asked about propellant. He smiled like a shopkeeper and said, "Less than you think." Someone else asked about guidance contamination. He didn't smile. We don't spin near sensitive sensors. Only people who've mopped after vector bleed say that out loud. A second echo hid in a patent application that never became a patent. It stalled, incomplete response, fees not paid, the usual ways to let an idea vanish without a fight. The claims were the giveaway. apparatus for inducing apparent mass modulation in a bounded payload using phased excitation of a conductive geometry. The drawings were intentionally vague, boxes inside boxes, but a dimension snuck past a redactor, 14.3 kilohertz. The same harmonic anchor chased. The number from anchor's logs threaded into a government website no one meant to be interesting. That's either a coincidence with a sense of humor or a proof of life we weren't supposed to catch. We asked people who don't get invited to glossy launches, but fix the benches afterward. A facilities electrician at a private test range told us about a night in May when a breaker didn't trip the way it had every other time in 15 years. Felt like a hand on the line, he said. Not a short, a lean. He replaced the breaker the next day, the way our campus did in the 199s, then didn't talk about it because no one wants to be the guy who says the grid got weird. There's a line the 2026 paper sneaks into its conclusion, half visible under blackout. Precursor models align with limited duration impulse anomalies. Extended dwell not recommended. Extended dwell. That's 6 seconds with a suit on. The caution reads like someone who's heard the safety officers count and believes in ceilings more than in press releases. We didn't get a confession. We got an ecology of hints. A redacted title with our term in its bones. A grid that blinked the way ours did, at a time wound around a test no one will discuss. A startup promising to fix mass fraction without acknowledging where that fix has to come from. And under it, a current of vocabulary and values, phase bands, abort lines, lateral control, and numbers that make you taste metal when you say them out loud. If Anchor was a room learning to speak, 2026 sounded like a room that had learned to whisper. It didn't promise anti-gravity. It didn't show cars on the ceiling. It took a math term that predicted a knee and folded it into a program that treats propellant as a suggestion. It remembered that lateral bleed exists and designed mounts like prayers. It kept its dwell short. It made the same bargain Anchor tried to make with itself. Enough time to learn, not enough to break. We're not dressing rumor up as revelation. We're saying the pattern repeats where money and motive meet math. The mass fraction inversion term walked like the lead asked it to. It left the bay, crossed decades, and turned up in a file that pretends not to know its parents. When we called a line in 199's Inc. predecessor math, someone in 2026 used the same phrase with a straight face and a budget line. So we follow the echo to where the story bends next. Not to a miracle, but to an industry that thinks gravity is settled until a narrow band of phase coherence says otherwise. The grid wobbles. The mounts hum. The numbers draw a knee. And behind a black bar, a sentence we can't quite read nods to a decision anchor made with a lever and a blister. 6 seconds, then stop. Disclosure/payoff, what Anchor really did. By the time we'd stitched the logs, the scars, the instruments, and the quiet memos into one frame, the picture wasn't a miracle. It was a pattern, a narrow mean window, phase coherence living between 0.67 and 0.71, where the world behaved as if mass were negotiable for about 6 seconds. Not absence of gravity. Not free lift on demand. An apparent mass shift that showed up the same way in 3 languages. A load cell bending lighter, a gravimeter sighing down, and an accelerometer clearing its throat upward. And braided through it, the signature that branded Anchor as Anchor, lateral vector bleed. The sideways lean. The eastward creep of tools. The floor's arcs drawing what the equations already suspected. Skeptics will say vibration, and EMI can fake a lot. They can. We try to make them fake this. What they don't fake cleanly is a band that ignores rotor RPM, but tracks a phase index like a dog on a scent. They don't reproduce a 6-second dwell that repeats across different rooms, different hands, and different instruments that don't share the same vices. And they don't explain why the only place in the logs where drift goes nonlinear, the knee that makes engineers sit up, is the same band where mounts chatter, breakers complain, and safety officers start counting out loud. Anchor didn't spring from nowhere. It sat historically bracketed by 2 bookends the community pretends not to keep on the same shelf. On one side, Podkletnov's 1992 YBCO claims, rotating superconductors and a whisper of gravity shielding that scorched reputations harder than it convinced peers. On the other, NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center Delta G attempts in the 1990s. Quiet, procedural, officially inconclusive, but rich in the vocabulary Anchor lived by. Coherence bands, Q-runaway, rotor overspeed, cryodiscipline, and the institutional memory of what happens when you promise gravity tricks and deliver only noise. Anchor carried both legacies, but it made a different bet. Don't chase discs to perfection. Drive phase through a bus, find a band that answers back, and stop while your fingers still belong to you. What it really did is smaller and more dangerous than a headline. It carved out a repeatable envelope, small signal, brief, fussy, where topology, timing, and current density biased inertia enough for sober instruments to notice and humans to feel in their teeth. Within that envelope, loads read lighter, upward microimpulses registered on isolation tables, and a sideways impulse leaked through mounts like a telltale in a rigging line. That leak, the vector bleed, wasn't a bug you tape over. It was part of the shape. It warned you what this effect wants to become if you get greedy. A guidance. Contaminant, a floor painter, an excuse for a safety officer to buy a second exit bar with his own money. The proof stack isn't one heroic smoking gun. It's a pile of ordinary things that refuse to contradict each other. Polygraph-backed testimony from a technician who knew the harmonic before he knew a part code. Procurement anomalies that put mu metal and cryo where the CAD says they should be and stop exactly when the vendor says the collar went Rev D. A bay with scorch arcs that arc toward the east and microfractures all pointing like compass needles. A power profile that coughed a Q-pulse twice on the night the kill stuck and mirrors a 2026 wobble in a place we're not invited. Gravimeters and accelerometers that, after filters and bad faith explanations, still hum the same 6-second note. And in the middle of the stack sits math with a sense of direction. A compact mass fraction inversion term that hugs the drift curve in that 0.67, 0.71 corridor and survives long enough to show up, redacted and renamed as Topology-Induced inertial bias in a 2026 propulsion context. That term is the quiet heart of why Anchor matters. In rocketry, mass fraction is a tyrant, the ratio that decides who flies and who dreams. If for brief windows under strict geometries, a payload's apparent mass can be biased by phase instead of burned propellant, you don't get free impulse. You get mass fraction inversion as a working model, small, fussy, and powerful in context. You get a new trade space, a lever, a way to move a denominator a hair without lying to conservation. It's not a drive, it's a bias. But biases, stacked and synchronized, build architectures. That's where the stakes leave the lab. You can spoof an inertial NAV if you can whisper sideways in the right envelope. You can nudge deployment windows if your stage can feel lighter for 6 seconds across a critical burn. You can hide grifts and monopolies in grids if devices can momentarily unload machines in ways tariffs can't see. This is why the memo didn't need capital letters to swing hard. Contain, compartmentalize, deny wasn't melodrama. It was a plan to keep an unruly, narrow effect from becoming a public circus or a private weapon without procedure. Anchor also taught a limit the hard way. It didn't produce cars on ceilings. It produced a blister on a palm and a collar that changed color. It taught the room that 0.70 isn't a suggestion. It's a cliff. It gave operators a culture. Dwell short, count out loud, abort at the line, respect lateral like it's angry. And because 3 men signed paperwork in a beige car, it arranged for the limit, and the math that describes it, to outlive the machine that taught it. The missing engineers didn't vanish to protect a miracle. They traded their names for the survival of a model, the mass fraction inversion term, and for a hard limit the safety officer would never let go of, the 6-second ceiling. A postcard with a lighthouse told a daughter what a foyer full of NDAs never would. Someone's still steering. A dead drop drive told us what a press conference never will. Here's the knee, here's the ceiling, here's the language you'll need when you meet both. And a redacted abstract in 2026, wearing Anchor's math under a different coat, told us the bet paid. Quietly, behind doors where dwell time gets scheduled like a meeting in lateral is a line item in mount design. So what Anchor really did was force a question we're not done answering. If gravity's grip can be biased and tight, punishing bands by geometry and timing, who gets to hold that timer? And what do we call the people who count to 6? The instruments didn't lie. The rooms didn't forget. The math didn't die. Everything else is policy and courage. Sometimes the truth isn't a reveal. It's a shape you recognize once you've seen it twice. Anchor drew that shape in 6-second strokes. If you want the redlined equations, the cleaned MF_NV workbook, and our 2026 crosslinks, subscribe and watch the follow-up on the hidden test that mirrored Anchor's wobble. Share this with the person in your life who thinks gravity never blinks.